internal carotid because we have an external carotid. So internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. Okay. We do have vertebral veins. We really don't pay much attention to them anyway, but we will see them as they do. Internal carotid arteries and vertebral arteries. So when we look at the venous drainage from the brain, we still have the vertebral veins, but instead of the internal carotid arteries, we see internal jugular veins. So remember when we talked about the nervous tissue, when we looked at the brain, at the sheep brain, we saw blood vessels on the surface associated with the pia mater. So after the arteries, middle cerebral, anterior cerebral, and posterior cerebral as our main branches spread across the surface of the brain on the lobes, they send smaller arteries into the brain tissue, which breaks down into arterioles and forms capillaries, and then that returns to the surface as small venules and small veins, and then on the surface of the brain we have the larger veins. Those veins, as you recall, join with the arachnoid granulations. Remember, we had the pia mater bulging, not the pia mater, but the arachnoid matter bulging into the sagittal sinus, the superior sagittal sinus. And we have the arachnoid granulations, or arachnoid villi. And down here, this would be the superior sagittal sinus. This would have been our arachnoid space, carrying CSF. And this would have been the surface of the brain. And so cerebrospinal fluid entered into the superior sagittal sinus via the arachnoid villi. But we also had veins on the surface of the brain emptying into the superior sagittal sinus. So the sinuses contain a mixture of CSF and venous blood, which is appropriate because the CSF fluid actually was derived from blood from the capillaries. Remember, the capillaries of the pia mater and the ependymal cells form the choroid plexus. And that's where we got our CSF. And that's a cycle. So we have to return that fluid back to the blood, and we do so via the arachnoid villi. So CSF fluid is going to cross from the subarachnoid space into the sagittal sinuses, and we learn the superior sagittal sinus. Today we're going to look at a few others, not all of them, but the primary ones. And so we have, back to the one that you're most familiar with, this is a sagittal view. And we have the sickle-shaped superior sagittal sinus passing in the dura mater. And remember, it's located right over the longitudinal fissure. That would be in the upper portion of the falx cerebri. In the inferior portion of the falx cerebri, we have a thinner, less well-defined inferior sagittal sinus. And we can see these in the sagittal head models or in the torsos, as well as we have a skull that shows the components of the falx cerebri. The two are connected, and this is new, so you can see it also in the sagittal view, by a straight sinus. And this would be at the back of the skull, all right, just at the thick portion of the occipital bone. And if you look at the skull models, even the plastic ones, you can see a groove, a depression created in the soft bone tissue matrix before it hardened. And now we have lateral branches to the right and to the left, created by the sinus as they curve around. So they would go from right to left on both sides, and these are known as the transverse sinuses. There are two of these, obviously. So there's only a single one of each of the others. And then right when just before they reach the temporal ridge, over that surface that contains the internal acoustic meatus, just before they reach that, each of them forms a sinusoidal curve and empties into the internal jugular vein. So if this is a transverse sinus, then these two components here, because of their S shape, are known as the sigmoid sinus. This would be the jugular foramen. And at the jugular foramen, we see the formation of the counterpart to the internal carotid artery, which is the internal jugular vein. We put the bony structure in there. So if I were to write out in sequence the flow of CSF fluid and venous fluid, we would have two different pathways. We would have the superior sagittal sinus, to the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein. Okay, that would be this pathway here. If we start out with the inferior sagittal sinus, which is right over the corpus callosum, then we would have inferior sagittal sinus to the straight sinus. And then this would go to the transverse sinus. We'd have inferior sagittal sinus to straight sinus, and then it would join the same pathway as we see available to the sagittal sinus view. I'm not going to diagram in except where it joins the subclavian vein, but we would also have the vertebral veins passing down through the foramen magnum and the transverse cervical foramina. Okay, now let's follow the vessels, the internal jugular vein, down to the superior vena cava, and I'll show you an overhead for these components. So I'm going to move this off to the side. Just to give you an orientation of the direction we're headed, I'll put the heart down here at the bottom. And draining into the heart, into the right atrium, we have the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is formed by the union, and you'll hear this phrase a lot. This vein is formed by the union of what two vessels? just like when we were talking about the arteries, we said this artery branches to 4 and 2 or 3 branches. What would be the name of those branches? So from the right side, and a longer vessel from the left. Why is this vessel longer? They both are called the brachiocephalic veins. Why would it be longer? What's the position of the heart? More to the center of the left, but the superior vena cava is in the middle. All right, so the heart is to the left, but the superior vena cava is right under the sternum. So the right brachiocephalic vein doesn't have as far to travel as the left one does. Okay? So notice that we have a pair of brachiocephalic veins, although we had only a single brachiocephalic artery or trunk. 2 B's means plural. So the superior vena cava is formed by the union of 2 brachiocephalic veins. Each brachiocephalic vein is formed by the union of an internal jugular vein and a subclavian vein. So this would be the internal jugular vein that we just described the formation of at the jugular foramen. And it comes down the neck with the internal carotid artery, and then it's found with the common carotid artery, and receives the subclavian vein. And I'm not going to keep drawing 2 of these forever, but just to keep us organized here. Those 2 vessels join together to form the brachiocephalic vein. So let's just follow one. Here's our internal jugular vein, and it has passed through the jugular foramen. So looking back at your notes from just a few moments ago, what would the vessel be that carries blood directly to the internal jugular vein? Which sinus? Sigmoid sinus. Okay, so at the jugular foramen, the sigmoid sinus ends to become the internal jugular vein. So this would be sigmoid sinus. Draining into the subclavian vein, we have a very slender external jugular vein. I'm going to save space here by just putting the numbers on this side, but it would be the same for both. This does not travel with the external carotid artery in the neck. The external carotid artery is under high pressure because of the arterial flow, and so it's protected by the muscles of the neck, and we really only see its branches. External jugular vein is found superficial to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Use that in lab to help you identify it. It's much thinner than you expect. You would have the skin, you would have the sternocleidomastoid muscle coming in at an angle from mastoids between the sternal process and mastoid process, and then superficial to that, and I'll show it to you in the models or if you're in Lancaster's class, be sure and look for it. Superficial to the sternocleidomastoid would be the external jugular vein. Now, what were the branches of our external jugular artery, our external carotid artery? There's a whole bunch, but I asked you to learn facial. And the terminal branches on the side of the scalp, superficial temporal. Okay? However, our facial vein typically drains into internal jugular. So it doesn't have the same passageway. We find it on the face with the facial artery, and it joins several other veins around the nasal passageway that carry blood back into the skull to sinuses that we did talk about that are associated around the sella turcica. And so that triangular area from your nose to your upper lip is called the danger triangle. These vessels, these veins in this area do not have valves. Blood flows by pressure difference. And so popping a pimple in this area can actually drive the infected material back towards the brain. Okay? So you want to stay away from that area. Because there aren't valves present, so pushing that on that could actually send it back into the brain. All right, so facial vein. There can be a connection between these two called the retromandibular. I'm not going to draw it on there because I'm not asking you to learn it. All right, but if you look at diagrams and models, you may see that connection. We have additional veins from the back of the skull, from the neck area coming here, and we also will see our superficial temporal vein. So that's the drainage as far as we're going to cover it, coming from the head and neck. The last little one I'm going to put in here is our vertebral vein, and that kind of comes in from the back between these two. So I'm just going to draw a little short one here. It's actually longer. So let me just show you a view of this on the overhead. This is looking from the right side. It shows the sinuses as well as the right side of the vessels draining into the superior. So up here, shown to be deep to the skull, we would have the superior sagittal sinus, the less formed inferior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, and then it's showing one of the transverse sinuses, and the sigmoid sinus coming down to form the right internal jugular vein. Here would be the facial vein. And that is draining into internal jugular. This is that connection I talked about that I didn't put on the board. Here would be superficial temporal vein coming down the external jugular. So external jugular drains into the subclavian. And then this is showing vertebral vein draining into the subclavian between internal jugular and external jugular. All right, now let's look at the vessels that drain into the subclavian. So again, we have the same deep vessels that we had. This is just a schematic component here. Once we look at veins, look how confusing that is. Because there's a whole bunch of other superficial veins that don't even have names. They're called communicating veins or venous communicantes. All right, so looking at our charts in lab, trying to find the vein here that you need to find can be a little difficult, and so you know to ignore a bunch of these other ones. So let's focus on the pattern, and I'll diagram that pattern on the board. And we have our deep veins. These deep veins follow the same, they're found with the arteries. So we have ulnar and radial arteries. We have ulnar and radial veins. We have a brachial artery. We have a brachial vein. We have an axillary artery and an axillary vein. All right, so I'll draw those first on the board. And then in a different color, we're going to have a rather fat forearm. Be able to get all of that on there. In a different color, I'll diagram the superficial vessels. So I'm going to move this up over here on this side to give a longer arm available. So internal jugular, vertebral, and external jugular. And then remember, veins are blood is formed of blood flowing back to the heart. So while it's a little awkward, actually I like to draw the vessels to remind you that the blood is flowing back to the heart. So down at the lower extremity, I'm going to ignore the palmar, venous palmar, and dorsal venous arteries at first, okay? So we're just going to start with the radial and ulnar vein. So in our most medial structure, we have the ulnar vein, and then we have the radial vein joining it. That forms the brachial vein. And then at the same areas, we have it changing from brachial vein to axillary vein, and then axillary vein to subclavian vein. So ulnar vein is going to be found with the ulnar artery. Radial vein with the radial artery. And brachial vein. Now before I label the other components, I want to draw in the superficial vessels. All right, so if you look at your forearm, you can see that there are vessels lying just deep to the subcutaneous area of the skin. These are the superficial veins. They're under lower pressure, so they don't need as much protection as the arteries do. And they have valves, just like we talked about. So in this vein here on the anterior surface of my forearm, I can compress it and melt the blood back towards my heart and find out where those valves are by how far apart I can compress my fingers, the things I do when I'm bored in meetings. Sit there and find my valves. All right? So we have a pair of superficial veins and then some smaller ones that connect them. I'm going to draw these in a different color. I wanted purple, but I took it out last week to save for lecture, and then of course I couldn't find it today. So I'm going to use green as to distinguish the superficial components. And starting on the back of the hand, we have what's called a dorsal venous arch that runs from medial to lateral at the base of the knuckles. And so we're going to start medial to lateral. And then this runs up the lateral aspect of the forearm. And finally, it empties into the axillary vein just prior to it becoming the subclavian vein. All right, so this is just prior to the clavicle. So at that point, this is going to be the axillary vein, and the subclavian vein, and I'll label it in just a moment. 11. So this superficial lateral vein is known as the cephalic vein. It is superficial. When you are in the anatomy lab, you will notice one of the torsos on the side of the room showing the deltoid muscle and pectoralis major muscle. This vein becomes visible and a groove between those two muscles. So if you're looking at bodybuilders that have dehydrated themselves prior to a show, their veins kind of stand out, and this is one of the ones that you can see. This is not the axillary vein, all right? Please don't label it as such if you see it on a quiz or on the lab exam. Axillary vein is going to be deep in the axilla with the axillary artery. The one that you see superficial between deltoid and pectoralis major is the cephalic vein, all right, after it's come up the lateral aspect of the forearm. Starting on the medial aspect of the forearm, again, I have a very wide forearm here. Traveling up the medial aspect and entering into the axillary just after, let me bring it up a little higher, just after it becomes axillary. So at the point where brachial changes to axillary, we have the cephalic vein. Sorry, we have the basilic vein. Not basilar. Basilar was our artery in the skull. Remember the two vertebral arteries joined to form the basilar artery? This is basilic. Kind of like the big snake of Harry Potter, basilisk. So, now, this vessel, between the two, is starting here and ending there, we have axillary vein. So both of these two, cephalic and basilic, will enter into the axillary vein. One just after it becomes axillary, and the other just before it becomes subclavian. So again, subclavian, this is number 3. Okay. So those are the two major superficial vessels of the upper extremity. Lateral is cephalic, medial is basilic. And they are joined at the elbow. Okay. This joining at the elbow has a Y pattern, or it has an H pattern. So we have two models in lab. The wire model shows the Y pattern, and our flat green model shows the H pattern. So I'm going to diagram that for you. All right, and I used to not talk about it, but then they were showing up as different models. So this is the H pattern. So connecting basilic and cephalic is a single vessel known as the median cubital. And I'm just going to write that right here. Your cubital fossa is the bend of your elbow. Coming up the midline of the forearm is another vein that can either drain into the median cubital or can drain into the basilic, and I'll kind of draw it in here doing both. You can either go directly in there or it can go into the basilic. And your forearm is the antebrachial, anti meaning for, brachial meaning arm. And so this vessel is known as the median antebrachial vein. So it's going to draw, it's going to come right up the midline like this. Okay. I know these are not water soluble, but I'll scrub when I get to them. So starting here, coming up like this would be cephalic. All right. Starting here, coming up like that would be basilic. Cutting across, and this is often where blood is drawn. If you're not trying to do arterial blood gases, just getting blood for cholesterol, whatever, would be median cubital. And then coming up the center line would be median antebrachial. Okay? That's the H pattern. Okay? The Y pattern, and I had a student a couple years ago at AR that had this perfectly, one on each arm. Should have taken a picture of her. The Y pattern, we start out with cephalic and basilic. But then now instead of having median cubital, these each, we have the median antebrachial, and then a branch goes to either cephalic or basilic. So you would still have a median antebrachial, but then you would have a median cephalic or a median basilic. Okay. Let me draw that on the board over here very briefly. And we'll leave out the deep components. But here would be cephalic. Here would be basilic. And then that would be the median antebrachial. So because this is a left arm, this would be medial. Cephalic. This then would be the median. Basilic. Median cephalic. And median antebrachial. So we're missing the median cubital. Again, the only reason I put them up there like that is because the diagrams and the models in lab can show both, and otherwise it can be confusing because it doesn't match completely one or the other. All right, so yes.
So does it just grow different ways in different
Yeah.
people? Or?
In fact, that woman that I was talking about had it one way on one arm and the other way on the other arm.
Oh, yeah.
So it's the same. All right, so blood can come up the lateral forearm, either the cephalic vein going into axillary, or it can come up the radial vein going into brachial and then into axillary. All right, so there's two options from superficial or from deep. Then we have axillary to subclavian, subclavian to superior vena cava, and then finally into the right atrium. Now let's look at the chest region. And you may have noticed that when I drew the superior vena cava, I drew a branch coming into it. If you look at the models in lab, the superior vena cava not only has these two branches at the top, which are the right and left brachiocephalic veins, but there is another vessel that arches into it from the right. So superior vena cava is draining blood from the upper extremity, from the head and the neck. Inferior vena cava is draining blood from the lower extremity, the pelvis, and the abdomen. So what region are we missing? The chest wall. All right. We don't have a vessel behind the heart that is traveling with the aorta, because we have this break between the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. So we have to have some vessel that drains the intercostal vein between the ribs and empties it into the superior vena cava. Right? So that's what we'll look at next, is the anterior, the chest wall drainage. So we're going to be looking at the azygous and the hemiazygous vessels. I'm going to draw the diaphragm right here. We'll place the heart in place here. Inferior vena cava, inferior vena cava down here. These two vessels that we're going to look at actually start in the posterior abdominal wall. They are called ascending lumbar veins. You don't have to know that, all right, but just to be accurate, that's where they start. And in the posterior abdominal wall, they are going to receive segmental veins known as lumbar veins. I'm just going to write those in. Do you remember the posterior branches of the abdominal aorta were the lumbar arteries? And they passed around and supplied deep muscles of the back and the spinal cord. So we also have some of those lumbar veins going into this ascending lumbar vein. I'm going to put that in parentheses because you don't have to know that. However, when it gets through the diaphragm and gets to the posterior chest wall, we have our intercostal veins. Remember the posterior intercostal arteries came off of the posterior surface of the thoracic aorta, and traveling with those posterior intercostal arteries, we have posterior intercostal veins. The anterior intercostal veins travel with the anterior intercostal arteries and go into the internal thoracic vein, which we're not going to worry about. Okay, so we're just looking at the posterior surface. So these are all intercostal arteries, posterior intercostal arteries. And the vessel that they're draining into, what was my last number?
Arteries or veins?
Was the arteries thing? Sorry. Veins. What was the last
13
number
was
that
the last one you did. 13.
13. Okay. So 14 over here is known as the azygous vein. And it empties into the superior vena cava. So 3 vessels actually drain into the superior vena cava, to brachiocephalix and the azygos. Now that takes care of the right side. On the left side, we have a similar vessel that is receiving lumbar veins. Passes behind the heart on the left side of the posterior chest wall, and then it will arch over, cross over the vertebral bodies, and empty into the azygous vein. And this vessel is known as the hemiazygos. These are best seen on the circulatory wire models in lab. There is an accessory hemiazygos that I don't test on. I'm just completing the picture here. I'll put that in parentheses. Okay. Again, this is posterior. It's going to drain posterior intercostal veins from the right and left side. So the next drop-down image I'll show you from the projector is a view of the wire model from lab, right, so that you can take a look at it. It's one of the few vessels that I will tag up close to the heart because it's so tight on the anterior surface, all the branches, the arteries, and so on, that can be difficult to visualize. came off the internet. If you look up circulatory wire blood vessel model, or blood vessel wire model. But it helps to study the models in lab first, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So again, it's a posterior view, because these are muscles that are on the posterior wall of the chest cavity. So I'll give you some orientation. Over here on your left is the posterior view of the aorta. So these vessels coming off right here would be the posterior intercostal arteries. This is the left side. Then that makes this the hemiazygous vein. So as you're looking at the model, its left is your left as well, because you're looking at the posterior view. And you can often double check that by recognizing that the hemiazygous is crossing over to drain into the azygos. Okay. So this would be the azygos draining into the superior vena cava, and the hemiazygos crossing from left to right to empty into the azygos. And this would be the accessory one that you don't need to worry about here. So that now are vessels that drain the chest wall. Next area we're going to look at, we should start with the lower extremity, but I kind of go in the same order as I did with the arteries, are veins that drain the abdominal organs. Right? And if we look at this next image, these are the vessels that empty into the inferior vena cava. We are missing the veins that drain the intestines, the veins that drain the stomach, the veins that drain the spleen. Those veins do exist. So we have a superior mesenteric vein with our superior mesenteric artery. We have a splenic vein with our splenic artery. But those vessels do not go directly into the inferior vena cava. So if we look at this diagram to give you some orientation, the aorta would be over on this side, right, passing through this opening. Here are those ascending lumbar veins that I was talking about. We just drew going up into the chest cavity. So let's look at those vessels that drain into the inferior vena cava first, and then we will add these veins. Okay, they do exist, but they all go to the liver first. All right, so you'll notice at the top of the liver, we have these veins right here, the same ones that you see here, coming out of the liver. But the blood has to enter the liver first from down here before it passes through the liver. We're going to look at this as part of a portal venous system, and then we'll see it again on our next unit when we talk about the digestive organs themselves. So the only new vessel that we have here is we get rid of the celiac trunk. We don't have a celiac vein, right? And we add a hepatic portal vein. Kind of flip one for the other. They're different locations, but otherwise our vessels are going to be the same. So now I'm going to take the diaphragm and move it up higher to give me room in the abdominal cavity. And similar to what I did with the aorta, I'm going to draw the inferior vena cava in first and then diagram the branches going into it. So the inferior vena cava is formed by the union of the two common iliac veins and passes up. It's more in the center of the abdominal cavity. The aorta was slightly to the left. And draining into draining into the lumbar cavity, into the inferior vena cava, we're going to have lumbar veins. So the lumbar veins draining into the ascending lumbar vein as well as additional veins going directly into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so we have both. I'll draw in just a few of those, even though they are vein should be the next one that we see, and it does exist, but it doesn't drain into the inferior vena cava. Okay? The next set of veins, if we're following the arteries that branch off of the aorta, are the gonadal veins, either testicular or ovarian. And on the right side, we will see the right gonadal vein draining into the inferior vena cava. So this would be the right gonadal vein. The left gonadal vein does not drain directly into the inferior vena cava. So let me put the kidneys in place here. We have our large renal veins. Those will drain directly into the inferior vena cava. And then on the left side, our left gonadal vein drains into the left renal vein. So if you were to make a list, I would have a question on the lecture exam and say, all of the following veins drain into the inferior vena cava except left gonadal vein would be one of those exceptions. Right gonadal vein does, left gonadal vein does not.
Where does it drain?
It drains into the left renal vein. And we have our renal veins. And we don't specify whether they're inferior or middle or not, just adrenal veins. Then we should have a superior mesenteric vein, and we do, coming from the small intestine and most of the large intestine, but it does not drain directly into the inferior vena cava. Our gastric vein and our splenic vein and our hepatic veins. Well, we do have hepatic veins coming out the top of the liver. All right, so up here, we'll put in a set of hepatic veins. And then finally, draining from the inferior aspect of the diaphragm. We have our inferior phrenic veins. We would find them with our inferior phrenic arteries. All right, so those are the only veins that we cover that drain into the inferior vena cava. Inferior phrenic, hepatic, adrenal, renal, right, gonadal, and lumbar. Of course, then our common iliacs as well, because that's what forms it. The rest will eventually. Okay? And that brings us to a discussion of a portal system. Now, we didn't cover the physiology of the endocrine system, so we really did describe a portal system having to do with the hypophysis or the pituitary gland. So let me just take a moment here to describe what a portal system sequence is. I'm going to erase it eventually, but because I have the space here. So our typical blood flow, if you recall, is artery, artery to arterial, capillary, capillary to venule to vein, right? That was our sequence of blood supply, each one being lower pressure than the previous. With the portal venous system, we have an exception. We have a variation. Instead of having one capillary bed, we have two capillary beds. And so we have in our portal system, and this would be a venous portal system. In our next unit, when we talk about the kidney, we'll talk about a renal portal system, our arterial portal system. But we have artery and arterial and capillary bed 1. And then we have veins. I'm ignoring the venule just to save time. All right, and then we would have a vein. And that's normal. But then we have a second capillary bed. Capillary bed 2. And then we go to veins again. So we have two capillary beds. The advantage of this, remember capillaries have the thinnest walls. They have just the simple squamous epithelium and loose connective tissue. And because of that thin wall, we have the exchange of gases and nutrients and waste. And then we go back to the heart. We pick up oxygen and then send that back out again. Well, with the portal system, we allow exchange twice without having to take the time to go back to the heart. So with our hepatic portal system, most of our food substance is absorbed across the walls of the small intestine. And what's the artery that supplies the small intestine? And most of the large intestine? Superior mesenteric artery. Gastric is the stomach. So let's say that our artery is the superior mesenteric artery. It goes to the walls of the small intestine, provides oxygenated blood at the capillary bed, but also at the capillary bed is picking up nutrients. It's picking up digested proteins, the amino acids. It's picking up simple sugars. And normally, in our normal pattern, it would have to go back to the heart before it would go to any organ in the rest of the body. The liver is the largest gland within the body. It stores the glucose as starches, as glycogen. It takes the amino acids and makes proteins, transport proteins, and clotting proteins. So to save time, it would be easier if we sent that directly to the liver. Allow it to get first dibs at all the nutrients. And that's what happens. So the capillary bed reforms as the superior mesenteric vein. That goes to the liver's capillary bed, and the liver now has the opportunity to take out its nutrients, and then it reforms as the hepatic vein leaves the liver and goes back to the heart via the inferior vena cava. So this is a bypass system or a portal system. Bypasses the heart for part of that journey. Okay. So may I erase this part right here, this description? Okay, so a portal system has two capillary beds, allowing two sites of pickup and delivery. So I'm going to draw the portal system over here. It just gets too confusing to lay it on over the liver, but I'll show you an illustration over the inferior vena cava. So here we would have our liver, because that's where our second capillary bed is. And our portal system is formed by the superior mesenteric vein. Coming from the small intestine. And it forms a union with the splenic vein, obviously coming from the spleen. from the large intestine, which is mostly absorbed across the large intestinal wall as water, and some fat-soluble vitamins, including vitamin K, produced by the bacteria in the large intestine. So that's coming from the left, with our superior rectal and our left colic vein. And it runs into the splenic. And superior rectal. And that's for the descending colon. So our actual portal vein is formed by the union of superior mesenteric and splenic. Those two vessels together, splenic and superior mesenteric, form what's known as the hepatic portal vein, which I often refer to just as the portal vein. Now, within the liver, traveling with the hepatic portal vein, carrying oxygenated blood into the liver, we have our branch of the celiac trunk, which is the hepatic artery. Now, normally we have an artery and a vein going towards an organ. We would have the artery carrying arterial blood into the organ and the vein carrying deoxygenated blood out. This is a unique situation where we have venous blood going into the liver, parallel in flow with arterial blood. Both of them are going into the liver rather than one going in and one coming out. And that's because the hepatic portal vein is rich in amino acids and simple sugars such as glucose from the small intestine. The hepatic artery is rich in lipids and oxygen, because the lipids absorbed from the small intestine have to go a different route. And both of those, all of those are being carried into the liver. The arterial and the venous blood actually mix together in large capillaries and flow by the liver cells. Once that has been completed, the hepatic veins then empty into the inferior vena cava. So it would be incorrect to call this a hepatic vein. These are the hepatic veins up here. Okay? This is the portal vein. And no partial credit if you call it hepatic vein and just say, well, I forgot the word portal. Because hepatic veins are entirely different components. So we still have a superior mesenteric vein. And in this area down here, it would be traveling with the superior mesenteric artery. We would see the two of them together. We would see the splenic vein with the splenic artery. But as those return in this direction, instead of going into the inferior vena cava, they flow into the portal vein. Okay? So none of these vessels is going to empty directly into the inferior vena cava. Only the hepatic veins do after it's gone through the liver. And we have a model of the liver in lab that I usually bring out at this time. I don't wait for the digestive system so that you can see that flow. All right, now let's look at the lower extremity. So again, we'll carry vessels up from the lower extremity to the pelvic cavity, the common iliacs. This time we only add 2 new vessels. So we have the deep veins of the lower extremity, but we add 2 superficial veins. Right? Let's see where we are on our list here. diagram over here? Can you guys see it? So, inferior vena cava, formed by the union of two common iliac vessels. It's really shallow here. So two common iliac veins are going to join together to form the inferior vena cava. We have our median sacral vein here. And then the two common iliac veins are formed by the union of internal iliac with external iliac. And the internal iliac veins are going to drain the same organs that the internal iliac arteries supply. So coming from the anal area, coming from the lower rectum, coming from the uterus and the bladder, from the vagina, are going to be veins that drain into the internal iliac vein, right? So internal iliac vein joins with external iliac vein and forms the common iliac vein. Now I'm going to start down here in the foot. Remember, our blood flows towards the heart. And so on the bottom of the foot, I'm going to make this leg a bit short, just so everything can fit in here. On the bottom of the right foot, we have, traveling with the medial plantar artery, we have the medial plantar vein. And coming from the little toe, we have the lateral plantar vein. I don't remember what my numbers were, so we'll just write the name. So medial plantar vein on the big toe side. Lateral plantar vein on the little toe side. And those two are going to join together on the posterior surface of the leg to form what vein? Posterior tibial vein. What was our lateral branch of the posterior tibial artery? The fibula, all right? So draining into the posterior tibial vein, again I have a very wide cap here, so everything's not too close together. We're going to have our fibular vein. Travels with the fibular artery. Okay? Nothing different. Coming from the top of the foot, we have our dorsalis pedis vein, running deep to the extensor hallucis longus. We have the anterior tibial vein, and it joins with the posterior tibial vein to form the, what's the vein behind the knee? Popliteal or popliteal vein. Like I said, I have a really short leg here. So this would be the popliteal or popliteal vein. After it passes through adductor magnus, we see it on the medial aspect and anterior aspect of the leg as the femoral vein. Okay. Same vessels that we had with the arterial system. Blood is just flowing back to the heart. And so we have veins with those same deep arteries carrying blood in the opposite direction. And then we add two superficial veins. The longest vein in the body starts on the medial aspect of the foot and ends up in the femoral vein. This is so long, it's often used as grafts for coronary bypasses. So my father-in-law had a double and a triple coronary bypass, so about a 15-inch scar on the inside of each leg. And this vessel is known as the